So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming back right after lunch. I hope you had a good break and lunch, which I indeed had. My name is Kei Ono. I'm from the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, if you haven't seen me this morning. I'm delighted to welcome you in the third panel session, Keeping the Value of Resources at Their End of Life, Environmentally Sound Management of Plastic Waste. And again, this session is having a simultaneous interpretation, so please speak slowly, but keep in mind with the time. So you probably have heard that only about 9% of the plastic waste generated since 1950 has been recycled, with the vast majority either released into the environment or poorly managed. The Basel Convention is revising the technical guidelines on the environmentally sound management of plastic waste, but still the challenge ahead is multifaceted. We need to reduce the amount of plastic waste generated and ensure that waste is managed in an environmentally sound manner, which requires a significant investment in capacity and capability at the global level. So let's hear from our distinguished panels which interventions can help and end plastic leakage. How do we develop and scale up effective collection, sorting, and environmentally sound management of plastic waste? We will also hear about the importance of the informal waste sector in achieving environmentally sound plastic management and legal and policy framework to strengthen the management of plastic waste. So first we have Professor Linda Godfrey. She's attending online and principal scientist at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, and an associate professor at Northwest University in South Africa. Her research interest includes the role of the waste sector in transitioning South Africa to a green economy, waste innovation, waste economics, integrated waste management, and the role of waste information as a policy and behavior change instrument. And then we have Mr. John Chweya. He's the president of Kenya National Waste Pickers Welfare Association since 2021. And John is a waste picker based in Kisumu in Kenya and is currently enrolled at Maseno University studying communication and media. And he's also a member of the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers. Then we have Madame Rokaya, and she's the director of the Basel and Stockholm Conventions Regional Center, located in Senegal, BCRC, SCRC Senegal here. And this center focuses on the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste and the development of national plans on various hazardous waste streams, including PCB waste. And we also have Professor Steve Fletcher. He's a professor of ocean policy and economy and director of the Sustainability and the Environment Research team. Steve is director of the Global Plastics Policy Center at the University of Portsmouth. So thank you very much for joining in a panel. And first, I would like to ask Linda, who is attending online, an overall perspective on the main challenges and opportunities for the environmentally sound management of plastic waste. Could you please tell us about the importance of shifting mindsets from waste to valuable resources? Which interventions can help end plastic leakage? Again, in about 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai, and hopefully you can hear me all right. I can't join you all in person today in Senegal. So thank you. Firstly, let me just say that I'd like to reflect on these questions from my specific context, that of Africa. Secondly, I think plastic leakage or plastic pollution is an indicator of a larger underlying waste problem. Plastic is a very visible pollutant. So to solve the plastic problem, we need to solve the larger waste problem. My third point is that we know now from global studies that there isn't a single solution to solve plastic leakage. It's going to require both upstream and downstream interventions. But we do know that improved waste management does have a big role to play as part of a suite of interventions, especially in low and middle income countries. Africa is currently facing numerous challenges around waste management, including weak city cleansing, inadequate waste collection, and poor waste disposal. Three activities that form the foundation of any waste management system. The Africa Waste Management Outlook, published by UNEP in 2018, showed that the average municipal solid waste collection rate in Africa is only around 50%, but varies considerably between countries from as low as 20% up into the 90%. We also see a big difference in waste collection between urban and rural areas in Africa, with most people living in rural areas relying on open dumping and burning to manage their waste. More than 90% of waste generated in Africa is disposed of at dump sites and landfills, often with associated open burning. These current practices are aggravating the plastic pollution problem. Local councils or municipalities are in many places struggling to render waste services. There is a low willingness to pay or an erosion in willingness to pay for services, which makes it difficult to cover the costs of cleansing, collection, and disposal. A review of international development cooperation in solid waste by the International Solid Waste Association showed that while development finance for solid waste management has increased over the past decade, it is still only a tiny proportion of overall development finance. It also hasn't helped that development finance has often supported the establishment of new infrastructure, such as engineered landfills, which returned to operation as dump sites only a few years later. The Africa Waste Management Outlook makes two recommendations which I think are relevant to all developing countries when it comes to addressing plastic waste. The first is to bring waste under control. Get the basics right. Empower municipalities. Explore opportunities through public-private partnerships. As we heard this morning, the Breaking the Plastic Wave study shows us that we'll need to bring 4 billion people globally into waste collection by 2040, mostly located in low and middle-income countries. That's around 500,000 people per day, every single day until 2040. The task is staggering. The second recommendation from the Africa Waste Management Outlook is to harness the opportunities of waste as resource. Only around 4% of municipal solid waste is currently recycled in Africa. Circular practices such as product reuse and repair are a part of Africa's culture, driving some circularity of waste plastic. However, we need to look at measures to scale up the reuse or recycling of waste by implementing the correct regulatory measures, supporting businesses, and improving education and awareness. Noting, though, that we are not going to recycle our way out of the plastic waste problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for raising that indeed plastics is a very visible problem. I mean, in the previous sessions, we talked about chemicals, which are invisible problem and had also have the risks to human health and environment. But indeed, to solve this visible problem, you mentioned that there's no one solution, and waste management is of one of the most effective in the region where we are now. And I was also picking up on issue of open dumping and that waste management. When you referring to those waste, it's not just only plastic waste, but municipal solid waste and solid waste management could also be affecting informal sector. And now I would like to turn to John. I heard that you started waste picking at age 13 and noticed inequalities and injustice that affect the waste pickers in your community, despite the integral role that they play in providing livelihoods and improving the environmental conditions. And then at the age 18, you started organizing waste pickers to defend and protect their interests and rights. So could you please share with us your experience a bit more? How important is the informal waste sector in achieving environmentally sound plastic waste management?
Yeah, thank you very much. What I'd like to say is that first, thank you, Minda, for first acknowledging that plastic pollution is a global problem. And most importantly, I mostly like calling it a global war. We are all in this war together. We are fighting it at different fronts. But I'd like to mention that waste pickers are normally at the very front line of this war because waste pickers put their life on the line, work with this plastic on daily basis. We live, eat, and literally our whole life, 360 degrees circulate within plastic. So I'd consider ourselves being on the front line of this war. Uh, I would also say that there are two aspects to view how important the informal waste workers are in management of plastic pollution because uh, we we kind of play a very integral role in managing this plastic. First, socially, I would say that waste pickers, especially in Africa, show the communities and show everyone around how plastic should be handled because these are things that are not taught in schools. At least from where I come from, waste management is not something that is taught outrightly from childhood. So it's something that waste pickers literally do it to show. Environmentally, I would say that waste pickers kind of reduce the amount of plastic that is normally deposited in the society, and I would say that this has very much impacted and also saved the kind of situation and the kind of life that everyone lives in the environment.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective from informal sector. You also highlighted, just like Professor Linda mentioned, about education and awareness raising and how important it is to bring up the capacity. And I would like to continue on this discussion with Rokaya. He's as the director of the regional center of the Basel Convention and Stockholm Conventions. Madame Rokaya, we would like to, vous avez, attendez,
Merci,
attendez.
merci.
We would like to hear your perspective on providing technical assistance to countries in the environmentally sound management of plastic waste. Are there any additional actions to support the control of transboundary movements or import and export of plastic waste, which could help manage plastic waste in countries? You could also mention about how to facilitate technology transfer to waste management. That would be great.
Thank you very much. Indeed, thank you for inviting the Regional Center for the Treaties of Stockholm and Basel. It is very important. I'd like to share with you the experience we've had so far, and it is very interesting to share things on this point. We do understand that we should be focusing on Africa by trying to take stock of the situation. We do see that some countries have been trying to legislate in the matter. It's 30%. It's not much, but it's already something quite powerful and telling on how important this is seen by all. Now we see that the dimension of ecologically rational and reasonable waste management is being acknowledged. In the light of what we will be sharing with our public, there are things that are being done, and I believe they are quite telling on the importance of the situation. We need to ensure an acceptable life cycle for these wastes, and we also need to allow for an appropriate cross-border movement of such plastics when things also allow. Our objective of high priority is to implicate governments in that, and we also need to equally involve the private and the public sector. We know the government are in a position institutionally to legislate, and this is quite important for the appropriate exploitation of such waste. Besides legislation, we need the nomenclature and indeed a way of assimilating systems, and besides that we need the green labeling of course is something for a government to establish. And when it comes to plastic waste, you do understand why this is important. But on the other hand, we need to make it possible for this strategy to be further assimilated by also the private sector and the informal sector. So, taking the example of those countries that have already legislated in the matter, we try to take inspiration and also implicate the informal sector and the private sector to go down the same path. We need, for that purpose, an appropriate context, and we definitely urge governments to allow for this possibility. The appropriation of these approach is something for all to consider, and also we're trying to reinforce the capacities, trying to enhance possibilities and uh, make it possible for such agencies as those depending from the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Transport, to take part in this process. Moving from one level to the next, all levels should be implicated: the local, the national, the regional. And if there's one thing I'd like to leave with you, is about the cross-border movements. We need to somehow make it uniform and standardize it if we really want to have an efficient outcome of this activity. Something else I'd like to leave with you: how to eventually make it easier for technology to be transferred. May we go down memory lane? There are some 10,000 different chemical products implicated in the manufacture of plastic. Can you imagine how much this is? And 25% of these is for plastic material that only has a very limited life cycle. Of course, we prioritize this latter part, the 25% of the plastics. That's where the whole problem is. For this to happen, we try to be holistic in our approach, and we also wanted to have a societal level of reflection. We need to make the community understand the importance of our approach, and just as the NGOs do it with other materials, we are implicating various popular brands like Coca-Cola to make the community understand why it is important to work on this kind of plastic. Do you know that 80% of our activity in that sense comes from the informal sector because of the type of containers and other plastic packaging material we're using? Hence, the importance of making the private sector understand and having the community become fully aware of the importance of our activity. Moreover, we need to be able to conjugate the local priorities and the national and international ones. Right now, we may see that high scale businesses are become quite visible in the domain of processing plastic, and we see, for example, various labels being shown on popular items like trash bins or flower pots or whatever. But what about the local level? Is it just as possible to raise the awareness amongst those people as well? This is why we invest in all these, and our aim is to have a sustainable system, a holistic approach, a holistic system, and we need to make it happen very soon. And when it comes to legislating, we need to give technology a chance to be truly capitalized on. Technology is also about protecting human health, but also make technology financially affordable. We're talking about Africa here, and the private sector needs to be benefited from all this just as much as the corporate sector. Accessibility, please mark my words, it's a very critical term. If you buy a piece of equipment and you do not know whether this can be appropriately disposed of, if you're a corporation, perhaps these can be easily understood and managed, but is the private sector and the day-to-day people also in a position of understanding the importance of this approach? This is why I am speaking about the ways to prolong the useful life of equipment. That's something also for the private parties to understand. On top of that, besides projects and budgets, we need to integrate the cost of set-off and amortization in various activities to make all this more affordable. This is the technical part I'm talking about. And one more point, maybe a couple of before I close, because sustainability is something we all talk about. We need clean technologies, but we also need more professional training on the logistics. For developing countries, it's crucial. Make it possible for appropriate education and training to be provided on these technical issues. We need a technical budget for that, a technical training budget, and another objective. We need to also find ways to amortize eventual impact, short-term impacts of such new approaches, because some approaches do incur some short-term impacts that have to be amortized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rokaya. Indeed, it is fascinating to hear how technical assistance can bring these very important stakeholders, inclusive of addressing plastic waste management. You mentioned the role of private sector engagement, informal sectors engagement, and what the government can make in terms of interventions, for example, legal intervention like putting in place appropriate labeling, green labeling, and so on. Indeed, it's a transboundary issue that global action is needed, but at the national level, it's important to put those things in place. And when it comes to technology transfer, the feasibility, affordability, and accessibility of such technology is very important, especially in African regions and other regions with challenges. Right, so following that discussion, I would like to ask Professor Fletcher about what more can we do in terms of strengthening policy and legal framework for strengthening plastic waste management. In the environmentally sound management strategy of waste under the Basel Convention, also one of the first steps is important to do is to understand the scope of issue by developing plastic waste inventory. And once you have that, government look at the gaps and synergies in legal and institutional framework. What is it you could tell us from your experience in analyzing those policy and legal framework for the environmentally sound management of plastic waste?
Thank you, Kay. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion again. The observation I'd make listening to the three previous interventions was one related to urgency and an urgency to act and to have some concrete measures that are legally enforceable to really drive change. One observation about the plastics life cycle and a lot of the interventions that have been made throughout today is that sometimes the complexity of the life cycle can obscure who is responsible to act and whether the authority lies to really drive change. So I think there is a particular opportunity here to be much more concrete about the changes that are needed and the mechanisms we can put in place to drive those changes. So, for example, in the presentation earlier from Julia and myself about the Spotlight report, we talked about a range of enablers that can support a global shift. One that we didn't really get a chance to talk about was how we take forward a more legal-based and rules-based system. So what rules might we implement at the global scale that are best implemented at that scale? Mm-hmm. And not just broad brush plastic pollution kind of targets and rules, but targets that are specifically about particular types of outcomes. So maybe we could have a target at the global scale for plastics reuse, or maybe a global target for reduction in use, or a measure of circularity as a target at the global scale. That certainly within the terms of the legally binding agreement going forward, could be legally binding terms of that treaty going forward. And that then sets a much stronger framework for action. And those terms would then be brought into the national level, through national legislation. So again, we'd have national targets, perhaps, and national legislation focused on reuse, reduction, and any other aspect of the plastics life cycle that we really wanted to drive through with a rules-based system. And I think part of the reason I'm saying is this, is I'm driven by the response to the need to be urgent and to do the things that make the most difference most quickly. And by changing the rules both nationally and globally around the plastics life cycle and thereby reducing plastic pollution, that seems to me at least to be the fastest way to respond to that level of urgency. So I guess what I'm saying is we need sort of concrete action, perhaps legally driven, rather than more plans and goodwill and good wishes, but really something tangible and concrete to drive change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting those important points out, as the UNIA 5.2 adopted this resolution with sense of urgency and with very, very ambitious goal of having this put in place as soon as possible. And now I would like to open the floor for a bit more for dialogue with all stakeholders. There are colleagues attending online and in room. If you have any questions, points you would like to make. So I already see 4 hands, 5 hands. So please be reminded of time. Put the questions in very concrete, swift, sweet, and short, and the responses to be also swift. Thank you for passing the microphone. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. My name is Sheku Bangura, Active Pan-African Ambassador for WhatsApp. WhatsApp means the War Against Single Use of Plastic. My intervention towards this one, I think we should have 3 methods that I see it is very much important in terms of trying to put trying to educate the people in terms of this single use of plastic. But before going forward, I would like to ask first, are we going to discourage the people totally not to use plastics? Or we are going to discourage them for the single use of plastics? And my own recommendation will be like this one. Getting rid of the single use of plastic, we have to observe 3 methods. The one will look like which targeted the media. The second one, which targeted on ground activity. Then the third one, we target community-based engagement. How can we do this on the air activities? We focus on the radio and television talk show, trying to educate the people about the single use of plastic. Then also we can target the digital, wherein we can create content and distribute it towards the media platform. Because we find out that most of the young people in Africa here, and not only Africa, are using more of the social media than any other platform. Like take a look over the Facebook page. When you check the statistics of the Facebook page, you will see more of the young people that are using it. Then take a look of the Instagram. It's also the TikTok. So all these areas are digital platforms wherein we can help to educate our people about the single use of plastic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Then also,
let's give others also opportunity, all right?
Let me just
one last
Let me
point,
just clarify the 3 points that I made. When we talk about, again, the air, we talk about the radio and television talk show. Then when we talk about the on-ground activities, then you have to do like the community engagement, the town hall activities, then the caravan show, wherein you can get lots of young people and stakeholders within the community and educate them about the single use of plastic. Then finally, you can answer my question, which I asked. My question goes like this. Are we going to discourage the people not to use plastic, or we are going to discourage them for the single use of plastic?
Great, thank you very much. The question was very clear. Next one, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Sujiba from Sri Lanka.
Can you speak up or the microphone?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Yes, I'm Sujiba from Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And I have one point is, now we were talking about the waste dumps. So when we talk about the waste dumps, we also have the same issue in our country, and now we are moving on to better technology, but we have the waste dumps. So in the waste dumps, we have developed a rehabilitation guideline, and we have facing with the problem of disposing the plastic waste in those waste sites, which cannot be recycled. So maybe the incineration may be the possible way. So that type of activities need some funding. So those contaminated sites. And the other issue is last year we faced with a very pathetic disaster situation with this Express Pearl ship disaster, where 1,680 tons of plastics fell into the sea, right, with the burning of the ship. And because Sri Lanka is an island, it is not contaminated in one side, but it is all along the coast. Maybe 1/3 of the country coastline was contaminated, and we were unable to at least collect half of it. And it contains a lot of toxic material, and so altogether there are 84 billion pellets. So that is contaminated. We are a very rich country in biodiversity with the coral reefs and everything, so the entire system is damaged. So I think in the legal binding mechanism, this clearing of contaminated sites is also, I think, be taken up. And the other one is regarding the plastic waste, the fabric waste is one area that we are not discussing, but it also creates a lot of microplastics. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for mentioning about this Express Pearl accident with the plastic resin pellet. So I still see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands over. Could you please pass the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mary Williams from Tier Fund. And my question is around language. So the title of this seminar is about environmentally sound plastic waste management. And I wonder whether it should be socially and environmentally sound plastic management. There'll be a lot of talk over the next few days about themes and tracks. And when talking about solid waste management, let's ensure we're also talking about socially sound as well as environmentally sound. And that has 2 angles at least. One is around coverage that we've heard about today, the 2 billion people lacking access to solid waste management, and any response has to ensure coverage reaches them. But it's also about ensuring that the informal waste sector are included in solid waste management and plastic waste management responses, and that they are recognised and reimbursed appropriately for the work that they do. Thank you.
Right, thank you for bringing up this socially sound waste management element. Could you please pass the microphone? Yes, go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for giving me the floor. My name is Lahindao. I am born and raised in Senegal. but I'm representing CAPS. And my question is how youth and women in local communities can get support to reduce plastic waste and get benefits. Because the cause is here in Africa, particularly in Senegal, people are living in extreme poverty while sitting on plastic everywhere. And I think that we need to do concrete things in benefit of those peoples. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question. So just two more questions to pick up.
Hola, mi nombre es Soledad Mella, soy de Chile, soy recicladora de base hace 20 años.
Hi, my name is Soledad Mella. I'm from Chile, and I have been recycling for over 20 years, and I'm part of the Global Alliance. And I want to ask two questions that I think that are fundamental regarding participation and the true voice of recyclers. And one has to do with how the world of technology and the world of academia sees um, um, waste collectors or recyclers as a fundamental part of the change that is taking place at a global level. You talk about a high percentage, you talk about the industry of recycling, but nobody talks about who has brought up the industry of recycling. We all know that without us, recycling would not exist. And I would like to ask my colleague John how he sees the importance and the relevance of recyclers in this the situation of plastics recycling right now since the UNEA meeting, and how can we be better represented and how can our voice be better heard? Muy bien, gracias.
The last person.
Merci, madame, de me donner la parole.
Thanks a lot to give me the floor. I'm from the Ivory Coast, from the Ministry of the Environment. I was very interested listening to John. It was very interesting because in the country, in the Ivory Coast that I know, very often waste pickers are really not recognized, not very much. It's like a job for people who have lost everything, who've got nothing else to do, and it's not valued at all. So I would like to ask John, in your country, how do you live? How do people recognize you? Are you considered? How could we involve more young people to help you in this job? How to encourage them? I had to manage a lot of waste keepers, and I know what they've had to live through. And how does it work for you? How to face other people who do not know, who are not involved in this, they do not know that it can be an issue, that it can be reused, and its added value. I'd like to know what you think about this. Could you share your experience regarding this? Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you so much for this very active commenting. And so we've got questions that relates to single-use plastics and also contaminated sites, socially sound waste management, how local people can get support, and a question about the informal sector. Because we do not have whole lots of time, I would like to ask each one of the panel members to say 2 sentences to respond to those questions. Could I first invite John?
I would like first to mention that about the youth and the women, just like I mentioned earlier, that waste speakers are kind of more in the front line of this war. And if from where I come from, there's a very big dump site called Dandora that is in Nairobi. And in Dandora alone hosts like about 7,000 waste pickers working there, and most of them are women and youths. So this is kind of more of the social and economical aspect of it, where like there are very many livelihoods that are kind of accommodated or sheltered under the waste reclamation and also plastic recycling because they entirely rely on that for livelihood. These waste pickers also have families that also rely on the same job. So I think that mostly answers your question, brother.
Thank you. And Professor Fletcher?
Thank you. Thank you. I think to answer the question about both environment and social recognition of waste pickers in the informal sector more generally, then yes, absolutely, I fully concur with that. The other point I would make is that a lot of the questions focused on actions that could be taken at the national level with specific policies and specific pieces of legislation that might drive those changes. Again, going back to the point around focusing on the concrete actions that can be taken quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Rokaya?
In fact, I agree with John regarding eco-organism. It's an example of integrated policy to integrate different sectors with a legal framework which is recognized by the state. This is an example I've given. And we could have other examples. But regarding plastic waste, I think this is the best example to answer this question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I would like to ask also Professor Godfrey, Linda?
Yes, thank you. So some really great questions for that. I think first of all, to respond to the question, I don't think we're necessarily saying it's discouraging all plastic. I think we need to ensure that whatever approaches we adopt are evidence-based. Plastic does serve a very important role, especially in developing countries around things like food security, water security, healthcare, etc. The one around funding for incineration, I personally am a bit anxious around just moving from a, disposal scenario to a burn scenario. We're burning resources. The fact that we can't recycle them suggests that there's a flaw in the design. So I would rather say we need to critically look at the products that are being put on our market before we want to adopt expensive end-of-life technologies like incineration. The one around the informal sector, I think whatever measures we put in place, we have to be sensitive to the fact that it's going to disrupt the livelihoods of informal waste reclaimers or waste pickers. And so we need to make sure that we're working with them in the solutions we put in place. And then certainly around supporting the youth and women, I think, as we grow the recycling economy, there is a lot of opportunity for the youth and women in that space. But again, we have to make sure that we have the right policy instruments and the right incentives to allow recycling and to allow the private sector and business to thrive in this space. Thank you.
Linda, can I have my microphone, please? Okay. So thanks very much for your active participation in this session. As the new global treaty on plastic pollution is to promote, among others, environmentally sound waste management, the technical guidelines under the Basel Convention and other guidance, as well as best practices and lessons learned, what we have done good or what we haven't been achieved well, may be of relevance to the consideration in coming years. Our key takeaway messages from this session, therefore, could be: products need to be designed to be cycled back at the end of their use, not to become waste. Speakers refer to the importance of tackling planned obsolescence and extending the product lifetime. Effective collection, sorting, and environmentally sound plastic waste management practices will require significant innovation and investment to help build necessary capacity and capability, access to technologies, and will need to be tailored to different locations and conditions. Municipalities need to be empowered to scale up opportunities associated with integrated waste management. The informal waste sector is critical to achieve environmentally sound plastic waste management, and they need to be adequately included in plans to improve waste management and close dump sites. They need to have access to relevant technologies. They need to be engaged in private sector efforts. So I think that there have been so many important information and thoughts and views shared by panel members as well as participants. And thank you very much. With this, I would like to thank all of you and close this part of the dialogue. And I would like to invite Ms. Sheila Agoar Khan, UNEP Economy Division Director, to give us concluding remarks for day one of the multi-stakeholders dialogue. Thank you. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, everyone. It was an interesting day, but very short, I must say. Every time every group talked, I felt like, oh, there was so much more to hear. And then we stopped and we started another. So an important lesson as the negotiation process decides on its multi-stakeholder forum for the future INC meetings to see what lessons did we learn from this exercise to be able to transfer and think through how could a real multi-stakeholder dialogue take place where we can really use the space for innovation and a safe space to really debate about the issues. The messages that I saw from today, I think everybody in every group talked about system change. We heard about upstream and downstream not being connected in today's economy, that the upstream polymer production space and the downstream where waste happens are completely different worlds, that we have a linear economy and there is a need for a system change where these are both connected. We heard about reduce, reuse, and recycle. And on the upstream side, what does it mean in terms of reduction? How much virgin plastic is required in our plastics so that recycled content can come in? What are the kind of targets that we want to see and the kind of substitution we want to see? We heard actually in that same discussion on upstream that at the end of the day, there's a lot of recycling that's not possible because there's chemicals in the plastics that makes recyclability either not possible, not affordable, or just too challenging, let's say, from the kind of technologies that exist. And then, of course, the safety issue. And the discussion in the first group on upstream issues asked about, can we have transparency in the chemicals used? And how does that happen? How do we go to a system where we have less virgin plastic? What kind of regulation is needed to be able to shift that part of the economy? Then we went to a discussion on midstream in the plastic life cycle. And there were talks about, well, how do we make sure that no packaging ends up in landfills? But in general, how do we go from a system where we are used to owning our own products to one and then disposing of them, or at least disposing quite a bit of the material around them, to a system which is based on reuse and refill? What kind of architecture is going to need to come into this kind of system change? What kind of reporting is going to be needed from business, industry, and other stakeholders? And for that, what kind of regulation is needed? So on the one hand, is extended producer responsibility a space that is going to require some kind of policy change to make it happen? And while most speakers talked about legislation, there was one which caught my attention because they referred to the legislative drivers that are needed to be able to create the level playing field for many different actors in the value chain to be able to function, so that whether it's reuse and refill architecture, whether it's extended producer responsibility, that actors along that value chain understand what space they occupy. Is it the producers? Is it the converters? The brands and retailers? The consumers? Who decides who takes what action? And I guess that's where the negotiation process will be critical. And there was a last point in that session which says material difficult to recycle should be phased out so that everything is planned for reuse and recyclability. And then in the last session now, which was also very interesting, we talked about seeing the whole plastics issue, not just from an environmental space, but from a social space. What does it mean for the waste pickers? How do they become part of the whole negotiation process so that the solutions we put in place also will work for them and work for the economy in general? What are the kinds of basic infrastructure needed? And there was a discussion about, is it incineration or is it using plastic waste as a resource? And one of the speakers spoke about a flaw in design if we have to go to incineration, because then you're losing a very valuable resource. The discussion talked about how do we use cross-border issues to look at what does it mean for waste and how we move to recycling when waste might not need to move across borders. And of course, we have the plastic waste amendment of the Basel Convention that we have to keep in mind. There was a discussion that said only 10% of the weight of plastic waste is recycled today. And so on the one hand, while we want to move to no single use at all, there was a discussion which said all plastics should be reusable and recyclable, which takes us back then to the upstream. So at the end of the day, all of these, while we handle them in 3 different sessions, at the end of the day, we have to be able to see that even from the waste discussion, it took us back to upstream and the kind of regulatory environment that was emphasized as being able to create that kind of environment in which the rules are set globally so that the actors across the life cycle can take advantage of a very different economy. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussions for the rest of the week.